Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am your host, Annika, and this is Between Two Worlds. So, before I start blabbing away, I just want to go ahead and take a second to thank every single one of you. We are at 500 followers now, and that is just insane. Thank you, seriously, for all the support. I really was completely unaware of how many people just might like to tune into this, but here we are building something pretty cool, and I absolutely have plans in the future to keep this going and making us grow. Also, I got a lot of really great feedback on my last episode on coffee, so definitely a separate thank you for that because I really loved recording that one. All right, so Samhain is almost here, and instead of doing a pretty typical cover of it, I really want to talk about the Victorians. And there is something about this time period that honestly has been always alluring to me, but I thought it would be a great time to actually talk about how really fucking occult obsessed that the Victorians really were and really how they laid down some of the foundations to most modern witchcraft practices that, we even still use today. That's obviously been adapted, but really, it's an interesting subject, and I want to talk about it for my own selfish reasons because reading and researching on this is really, really fun. Plus, I thought this kind of spooky historical storytelling would be pretty refreshing for this season. So, obviously, the Victorians were very, very well acquainted with death. And this had a lot to do with launching the occult revival in the 1800s. Well, really through the 1800s. And they lived with death in a way that we can barely comprehend today. I know I talked about it a little bit in the death episode, but child mortality rates were brutal. Cholera outbreaks would wipe out entire neighborhoods in weeks. The Crimean War, the American Civil War, countless colonial conflicts. War was constant and it was personal. And, industrial accidents killed workers daily. Infections that we cure today with antibiotics were usually death sentences. That is no surprise. We have all heard the joke of a bag of hot Cheetos would kill 15 Victorian children. But every family buried their children. Every person walking around was carried with, this grief that would break us today. And I know in my death episode, I talked about the Victorian mourning period specifically and pretty extensively. But at least I could say is that death wasn't sanitized and hidden away in hospitals. It happened at home. Bodies were prepared by families, people died in your living room, and then you lived with that reality every day. And when you're that close to death, when it's not abstract, but immediate and constant and personal, well, that's where the boundary between the living and the dead starts to feel pretty thin. And this is exactly the driving force that for the curiosity to communicate to the dead. So pretty soon, for the Victorians, it really felt like communication with their past loved ones felt essential, needed even. So we know that, especially in the upper class society, the mourning period was elaborate, this multi year affair with specific clothes and behaviors and jewelry, and even the way that you decorate your home. But underneath that protocol was still that unprocessed grief. Something at the time that the more traditional Christianity really wasn't addressing, just telling you to have faith and wait patiently for your reunion in heaven and to accept God's will is unknowable. But for most people, that just wasn't cutting it, especially when you're burying your children on a constant, you're losing your spouses and family members and so on. So at the time, these new technologies were also booming. And really, this was all a perfect storm when you look at it in hindsight, because these technological advances began to change the way people thought about invisible forces. And this part is crucial to understand because they lived through the most rapid technological advancement in human history up to that point. Electricity was being harnessed, gas lighting was replacing candles, telegraph lines were sending messages across continents instantaneously, and trains were rapidly advancing. They were going so fast at the time that they really couldn't comprehend it. So the idea that the invisible forces are all around us, forces that could be measured, harnessed, communicated with, that didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. At the time, you could send messages from London to really anywhere through a wire. Why couldn't you send a message from the living to the dead through some other kind of invisible connection? If photography could capture images of people who weren't there anymore, why couldn't it capture images of spirits? Electricity could make lights flicker and machines move. Why couldn't this kind of spiritual energy affect the physical world? So the Victorians were living in a reality where the impossible was becoming pretty possible every day, and magic started to seem not so mystical, but more scientific. Just another invisible force waiting to be understood and harnessed. And then there was the influx of Eastern philosophy and practice through this colonial expansion. British officials stationed in India were encountering Hindu and Buddhist concepts that were completely alien to the Christian European thought. Ideas about multiple lifetimes, about consciousness existing separate from the physical body, about these systematic methods for spiritual development. These Eastern systems came with practical techniques that actually worked, meditation practices that produced measurable changes in consciousness, in this kind of energy work that created physical sensations. These were methods for achieving specific altered states that were repeatable and teachable. So, this really was revolutionary for Europeans whose spiritual practice had been limited to just prayer and faith. Here were systematic approaches to spiritual development that didn't require you to just believe, they required you to practice and experience. So you had, all these ingredients coming together at once. Devastating personal grief, creating desperate emotional need, this technological, these breakthroughs making invisible forces seem possible, and this new philosophical framework providing different ways of understanding consciousness and death, and practical techniques from other cultures that actually produced results. So, really, you had a very specific kind of Victorian mind that was obsessed with classification, the systemization, and the scientific method. These people didn't want to just dabble in the supernatural. They actually wanted to understand it and map it and create repeatable experiments with consistent results. So, this is where the concept of scientific occultism was born. And the idea that magic could be approached with the same rigorous methodology that was being applied to, chemistry or physics, that spiritual phenomena could be studied, documented, and developed. So, this brings me to talk about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And I'm sure many of you know what the Golden Dawn is, maybe you've even read it. But the Golden Dawn was founded in 1888 by three men: William Wynne Westcott, a London coroner who spent his days, examining dead bodies and his evenings studying ancient manuscripts, and Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, a brilliant but obsessive scholar who lived and breathed ceremonial magic, and William Robert Woodman, who was this retired doctor who was really um, fascinated by Rosicrucianism. These weren't romantic mystics wandering around in flowing robes. These were practical, educated Victorian gentlemen who approached magic like engineers. So they wanted to build something, this systematic, teachable, and repeatable method for spiritual development and magical practice. And what they built became a blueprint for pretty much the modern Western occultism. It all started with something called the cipher manuscripts, a collection of documents written in a coded script that outlined magical techniques and ceremonial structures. Now, there's been debate for over a century about where these manuscripts actually came from. Some say they were genuine ancient documents, others claim they were Victorian inventions, but really, honestly, it doesn't matter. What matters is what Mathers, Westcott, and Woodman did with them. They took these basic outlines and developed them into the most sophisticated magical training system the Western world had ever seen at the time. So, the Golden Dawn created the grade system that most magical orders really still use today: 10 grades corresponding to the 10 spheres of the Kabbalistic tree of life. each with specific knowledge, requirements, practical skills, and ceremonial initiations. You couldn't just, show up and start doing advanced magic. You had to work your way through the system, mastering each level before moving on to the next. And this was revolutionary. Before the Golden Dawn, magical knowledge was just scattered, it was inconsistent, often jealously guarded by individual practitioners. And the Golden Dawn systemized it all. They created detailed correspondence tables linking colors, stones, plants, angels, and planetary forces in ways that actually worked together. They developed ritual structures that built power progressively and safely. And they didn't just make this stuff up. They actually did study everything they could get their hands on, from ancient Egyptian magic, medieval grimoires, Kabbalistic texts, and alchemical treatises, Eastern philosophy. They then synthesized all of this into something coherent and practical. So let's take the lesser banishing ritual of pentagram, probably the most widely used ritual in modern ceremonial magic. Um, the Golden Dawn developed this by combining Hebrew divine names, archangelic invocations, elemental symbolism, and precise physical movements into a practice. Now, obviously, today this isn't the kind of practice for everyone, and I definitely don't do ceremonial magic. But I think, like all old magical texts and records, and while these methods are highly debated upon, I think it's important worth knowing about. So the Golden Dawn took the traditional tarot deck as well and completely reimagined it. This I really didn't know for a really long time. They assigned specific astrological, elemental, and the Kabbalistic correspondences to every card. They developed new spreads and reading methods, and they created detailed meditative practices using tarot imagery for spiritual development. So, the tarot system most modern readers use, the one where the suits correspond to the four elements, where the court cards represent personality types and elemental energies, where the major arcana tells the story of spiritual evolution. It's the fool's journey. That's all Golden Dawn innovation. And the Golden Dawn understood something that many practitioners in modern day kind of miss. Luckily, now it's becoming a much wider thing that's talked about in the magical community, but it's that altered states of consciousness are like any other skill. They can be developed, refined, and used for specific purposes. Their pathworking techniques allowed members to explore different aspects of the psyche, communicate with spiritual entities, and gain this practical knowledge that could be applied in daily life. And the people who went through the system, well, they became the most influential occultists in history. You all know Aleister Crowley, but he was a Golden Dawn member, and so was Arthur Edward Waite, the Rider-Waite deck, the one who created the most popular tarot deck in the world, and Israel Regardie, who preserved and published the Golden Dawn teachings for future generations, and W.B. Yeats, the Nobel Prize-winning poet who credited the Golden Dawn training with transforming his creative work. So now, while the Golden Dawn was busy systemizing Western esoteric traditions, something equally revolutionary was happening on another front. And this is a Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky. Yes, that Helena Blavatsky. And she was about to completely transform how Western occultists thought about spirituality, consciousness, and magical practice. Now, Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, but her real impact came from what she brought back from her travels in India and Tibet. Because here's the thing, while European occultists had been working with fragments of ancient knowledge, often filtered through centuries of Christian interpretation, Blavatsky encountered living traditions that had been practiced continuously for thousands of years. And she didn't just study these traditions academically. According to her accounts, she spent years training with the Tibetan masters, learning meditation techniques, the energy work, and spiritual practices, that were completely unknown in the West. Whether you believe her specific claims about secret masters and hidden teachings, what's undeniable is that she brought back practical techniques that actually worked. The Theosophical Society introduced Western occultists to concepts that are absolutely fundamental to modern practice, but were revolutionary at the time. So, the idea of chakras. the energy centers in the body that could be activated and developed through specific practices, and astral projection, the ability to separate consciousness from the physical body and travel to other realms. We've talked about this quite a lot before. So, reincarnation and karma as practical spiritual principles rather than abstract philosophical concepts. Theosophy brought the concept of systematic spiritual development through direct experience. And Eastern traditions didn't just ask you to believe in spiritual realities, they gave you methods to experience them for yourself. Meditation practices that produced measurable changes in consciousness, these breathing techniques that generated specific energetic effects, and of course, visualization methods that opened up new levels of perception. So, obviously, this was pretty revolutionary for the Victorian occultists who really had just been working with intellectual study and more ceremonial ritual. Suddenly, there were these practical methods for developing your psychic abilities, for exploring non physical realms, for achieving these states of consciousness that were described in these ancient texts, but had seemed impossible to actually attain. So, Annie Besant, who became the president of the Theosophical Society after Blavatsky's death, was particularly influential in developing practical applications of these Eastern techniques. So, she wrote extensively about how to combine Western magical methods with the Eastern spiritual practices and creating this hybrid approach that were more effective than either tradition alone that they found. So the impact on modern occultism was massive. The chakra work, the astral projection, the past life regression, the energy healing, all of these became standard parts of Western magical practice all of a sudden because of the theosophical influence. But more than specific techniques, Theosophy introduced the idea that spiritual development was a science that could be approached systematically. And the Victorians just ate this up. So, Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, which was published in 1888, laid out a comprehensive cosmology that attempted to synthesize the Eastern wisdom traditions with Western esoteric knowledge. It was dense, complex, and really difficult to understand, but it provided a framework for thinking about consciousness, evolution, and spiritual development, all that stuff. And of course, that book has immense history with many other things. But I digress. The combination of this theosophical Eastern technique with Golden Dawn Western ceremonial methods created something entirely new for this era. It's a synthetic approach to magical practice that combined the best of both traditions. Many of the most influential occultists of the early 20th century, including Rudolf Steiner and Alice Bailey, were deeply influenced by both movements. So now let's get into the really, really juicy stuff. Because while the Golden Dawn was developing systematic magic and Theosophy was bringing Eastern wisdom to the West, something absolutely wild was happening in parlors and living rooms across America and Europe. I know the whole Golden Dawn stuff is like kind of boring and the theosophical Eastern stuff, but it's really important for this whole era of time and the ghosties. So, regular people were doing this. They were not trained occultists or mystics, but the housewives and the shopkeepers and doctors were having direct contact with the dead, and they were documenting everything. The whole thing started with three teenage girls in Hydesville, New York in 1848, the Fox sisters, Margaret, Kate, and Leah. Maybe you've heard of them before, but they began hearing mysterious rapping sounds in their house. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of being, scared or terrified, they started to talk back, and they developed a communication system. One rap for yes and two raps for no. Pretty easy, right? Then they got more sophisticated, rapping out letters of the alphabet, asking complex questions, receiving detailed answers about people and events that they couldn't possibly have known about. So, of course, word spread. Neighbors came to witness, the phenomena became more complex, and multiple spirits claiming to communicate. Physical objects started to move, tables lifting up the ground, And the girls were tested, examined, observed by scientists and skeptics, and the phenomena just kept happening. Now, were the Fox sisters sometimes faking it? Most certainly. Almost everything I'm going to talk about here with the techniques and what was happening, a lot of it was pretty fraudulent, but some of it is mostly unexplained. So that's where things get a little bit complicated. But because of what happened next was that thousands of people of other, you know, cultures and families that started experiencing similar phenomena. Within a decade, seances became a mainstream social activity. And by mainstream, I mean like literally super, super mainstream. You could walk down the street, or it was like as often as going to Sunday church, not just among the grieving or the occult minded, but among perfectly respectable Victorian families. It was like a diner party, except the goal was to contact the dead. And they developed techniques that were practical and repeatable methods for spirit communication that actually produced results. So let's go over these techniques. The most common method was table turning. A group of people, usually 6 to 8, would sit around a small table with their hands resting lightly on the surface. They'd ask for spirits to make contact, and after a period of quiet concentration, the table would begin to move. I think there's like an episode of uh, Zach and Cody where this happens, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, so skeptics immediately claimed this was unconscious muscle movement. People pushing the table without realizing it, but the skeptics couldn't explain that tables were often lifting completely off the ground, tilting at impossible angles and moving with force than the sitters could have generated. So what was actually happening here? Modern parapsychologists think it was a form of psychokinesis, which, is the group's collective mental energy affecting physical matter. The Victorians just called it spirit power. But they started to figure out that certain conditions made the phenomena stronger. So things like dim lighting worked better than the bright light, groups with emotional bonds were more successful than strangers, and more particularly, people who were slightly skeptical but open minded got better results than both true believers or the complete skeptics. So they were essentially developing a technology for amplifying this psychic phenomena. Table turning was really just the beginning. The technique that really revolutionized spirit communication was automatic writing. And this method is simple. We still do it today. You sit with a pen and paper, you ask for spirit contact, then let your hand move without conscious control. What came out was often illegible, scribbling at first, but with practice, people began receiving coherent messages. Sometimes, in handwriting that was completely different from their own, sometimes in languages that they didn't speak, and sometimes containing information that they couldn't have known. So, Victorian researchers approached this, of course, scientifically. They love their science. They tested automatic writers under controlled conditions, which was honestly pretty interesting. They verified that the information that came through, they documented cases where the writer's personality seemed to completely change during the process. And what they discovered was that automatic writing worked by bypassing the conscious mind. When you stop trying to control what you're writing, you allow deeper levels of consciousness or external spiritual influences to express themselves directly. Now, clearly, seances and automatic writing should sound familiar. And I know we do a lot of automatic writing today. It's very common with spirit contact, and seances too, if you do a lot of group magical work. But the really weird stuff in the Victorian era happened in cabinet seances, and these were more elaborate affairs. They were usually conducted by professional mediums in specially constructed cabinets or curtained off areas. So the medium would enter the cabinet in a trance state. Sitters would observe from outside, and then things would happen that defied explanation. Spirit voices speaking from empty air, musical instruments playing by themselves, and most famously, ectoplasm. This strange, this web like substance that would emerge from the medium's body and form into recognizable shapes. And if you actually look up these photos, it is really interesting. Again, most of it was pretty fraudulent, but professional mediums had every incentive to put on a good show. The phenomena were observed under controlled conditions by serious researchers, so some of it is pretty unexplained. And the Society for Physical Research, founded in 1882, included scientists, philosophers, and scholars who applied rigorous methodology to investigating these claims. And some of what they documented remains unexplained to this day. So there was also this pretty ingenious innovation called the spirit trumpet. And this was a cone-shaped metal device that supposedly amplified spirit voices. These trumpets would be placed on tables during seances, and voices would emerge from them claiming to be deceased spirits, speaking directly to the sitters. Again, mostly fraud, yes, but some of that, I mean, how could you explain that? Researchers documented cases where the trumpets moved through the air independently, where multiple voices spoke simultaneously from different locations in the room, and where the voices provided verifiable information that the medium couldn't have known. The principle behind spirit trumpets wasn't actually acoustic amplification, it was really about creating a focal point for psychic energy. And the trumpet served as a physical anchor that allowed spirits to concentrate their efforts to manipulate sound waves in a specific location. Sound a little bit familiar, kind of like a spirit box? So what modern practitioners really, I think what we can learn from this Victorian spirit communication and these techniques is, I think, the group energy. The Victorians discovered that certain combinations of people amplify psychic phenomena, and they learned to identify, quote, sensitive individuals who seem to act as these psychic conductors for the group. Now, second, the power of environmental control. We do this a lot, and clearly it's useful. We dim the lights, we create a comfortable temperature, minimal distractions. When we want to talk to spirits, we kind of set the mood for them, and it works. So they really figured out that creating the right physical conditions made spirit contact more likely. And also the technique of passive receptivity. Whether it's automatic writing, table turning, or this mediumistic trance, the key is to get the conscious mind out of the way and allow deeper levels of awareness to operate. And fourth, I think the importance of documentation. I know a lot of other people will speak on this, but documenting, especially when it comes to spirit contact, is so, so useful. The most successful Victorian practitioners kept detailed records of their experiments. They tracked what worked, what didn't, and under what conditions. And I do this today. It's extremely helpful. These principles are still the foundation of effective spirit work. And I do want to talk about the role that women played in this field, especially um, through this time, because it was overwhelmingly dominated by women. And personally, I think this is pretty fucking badass. And it wasn't just accidental. Victorian society believed that women possessed a naturally more intuitive and receptive nature that made them ideal conduits for spirit communication. So, in theory, it was widely accepted by both believers and researchers of the time was that women's minds were less rigid, less analytical than men's, or men in the Victorian era were more trained to be logical and controlled and skeptical. Women were encouraged to be emotional, intuitive, and really open to influence because of, you know, more malevolent reasons, but it actually kind of worked in the end. Because what Victorian society saw as a feminine weakness, spiritualists recognized as this psychic strength. So women were believed to have what researchers called nervous sensitivity. A more delicate nervous system could detect subtle spiritual influences that men's coarser constitutions, would miss. Their supposed natural passivity was seen as the perfect state for spirit possession or control. And the very qualities that Victorian society used to justify women's exclusion from public life, emotional volatility, and this susceptibility to this influence, connection to the mysterious and irrational, suddenly became their greatest spiritual assets. And this created an incredibly unique space in Victorian society where women could not only participate, but they actually held authority. Female mediums became the central figures in seances, commanding rooms full of educated men and delivering messages that were treated as authoritative spiritual guidance. So for many women, mediumship offered a rare opportunity for public speaking, this intellectual engagement, and even financial independence. She told those men to sit the fuck down and listen. So obviously, some of the most famous mediums of the era were almost exclusively women. Fox sisters again, of course, but also figures like Emma Hardinge Britton, who became an internationally renowned speaker and author on spiritualist topics, and Leonora Piper. I always want to say Leonora, whose mediumistic abilities were studied extensively by the Society for Physical Research and never conclusively debunked. Now, as brilliant as the Victorians were at developing magical techniques, they also created some problems that the modern practitioners, I think, are still kind of dealing with. The biggest issue with Victorian occultism was their tendency to make everything unnecessarily complex. These were people who loved elaborate hierarchies, formal protocols, and intricate systems of classification. And they couldn't just have a simple fucking ritual. It had to involve multiple grades of initiation, specialized robes for different planetary influences, and memorization of hundreds of correspondences. The Golden Dawn, for all of its innovations, became so bureaucratic that it spent more time arguing about ceremonial procedures than actually doing magic. And they developed 33 different grades of advancement, each with its own requirements, examinations, and ceremonial initiations. Members spent years studying theory before they were even allowed to perform basic practical work. And the Victorian era also gave us some deeply problematic approaches to other cultures' spiritual traditions. Of course, that the Theosophical Society, for all of its contributions, it really was built on a foundation of Western superiority complex. And Blavatsky and her followers believed that they could take Eastern spiritual practices and improve them with Western rational analysis. Obviously, this is problematic. They cherry picked concepts from Hinduism, Buddhism, and other traditions without understanding the cultural context that made those practices so meaningful. And they created this hybrid of systems that often misrepresented the original teachings while claiming to preserve ancient wisdom. So clearly, this created patterns of cultural appropriation that modern occultism, I think, is still working to address. And the idea that Western practitioners can freely adopt techniques from any tradition without understanding their, cultural significance, without engaging with living practitioners of those traditions, without acknowledging the colonial dynamics that made that knowledge available in the first place. Modern practitioners are increasingly aware of these issues, and there's more emphasis on studying traditions in their proper context, on building relationships with practitioners from the cultures we're learning from, and on acknowledging the difference between appreciation and appropriation. I really just felt like I had to get that out there because obviously the Victorian era came with lots and lots of um, problems as well. But these occultists were also so obsessed with purity and pure bloodlines, pure traditions, pure magical techniques. And obviously, that couldn't be further from the truth with all this blending. But the Golden Dawn claimed that their knowledge came from ancient Egyptian mysteries preserved in this unbroken succession. Theosophists claimed access to ageless wisdom from Tibetan masters, and spiritualists believed that they were receiving direct transmission from, highly evolved spirits. And this created a mythology of authenticity that was largely fictional. Most Victorian magical innovations were exactly that. They were just innovations and combinations of different sources, creative interpretations of historical fragments, practical techniques developed through this experimentation rather than anything that was of ancient tradition, I guess. So obviously, modern practitioners have largely abandoned this whole purity obsession, and we recognize that effective magical practice is usually syncretic, drawing from multiple sources, adapting traditional techniques for your contemporary circumstances, and creating new methods based on what actually works rather than what claims ancient authority. So, with all that out of the way, before I wrap this up, I want to bring it back to the spooky feeling and actually tell you guys the accounts and stories of these seances and spirit communications because all of this, the correspondence systems, the ceremonial structures, and the automatic writing techniques, they weren't academic exercises. These were tools developed by people who were having real documented experiences that, they couldn't explain. So, I'm going to tell you about some of the actual recorded cases from this period because honestly, they're more fascinating than most ghost stories. And also, I will include some of the sources on these accounts in the show notes. So if you want to look into them and read them yourself, I will list them. They're super interesting. So there was this woman named Leonora Piper. I briefly mentioned her a little bit ago, who became probably the most studied medium in history. So the Society of for Psychical Research, and I just realized that this whole time I was saying the Society for Physical Research. Um, Clearly, I don't know how to type properly on my show notes, but it's the Society for Psychical Research. So please just pretend I said that the whole time. Anyways, they investigated her for over 20 years, from 1885 to 1915. And here's the thing, they did that because they were trying to debunk her. These were scientists, psychologists, and philosophers who went in completely skeptical. They would bring anonymous sitters to her seances, people she'd never met, whose names she would never know, and they'd have her communicate with supposedly dead relatives of these strangers. And she would provide incredibly specific details, not just, your grandmother loves you kind of stuff, but things like the exact location of hidden family documents, the context of private conversations that happened years before, and childhood nicknames that only family members knew. In one documented case, Piper contacted the deceased father of a sitter and told him where to find a missing will that the family had been searching for. The will was exactly where she said it would be, hidden in a place no living person knew about. And the investigators verified all of this. They kept very detailed records. So, William James, yes, that William James, the father of American psychology, spent years studying Piper and concluded that she was either genuinely communicating with the dead or demonstrating psychic abilities that science couldn't explain. And this wasn't some gullible Victorian spiritualist. This was one of the most rigorous scientific minds of the era. And then there were these cross correspondences, which are honestly some of the weirdest documented cases in psychical research because after several founding members of the Society of the Psychical Research died, different mediums in different countries, sorry, not counties, uh, who had never met each other, started receiving fragmentary messages through automatic writing. And each message was incomplete on its own. But when the researchers put them together, they formed coherent communications that seemed to be from the deceased SPR members. And these messages contained obscure classical references, even inside jokes, and detailed knowledge about the deceased individuals' personal lives and their scholarly work. So obviously, this really freaked everyone out because the mediums receiving these messages often didn't understand what they were even writing. They'd receive fragments of Latin poetry, even, or references to obscure historical events that meant nothing to them individually, but formed these sophisticated communications when combined with messages from other mediums. And this went on for over 30 years. Researchers documented over 3,000 cross correspondence cases, and the statistical probability of this happening by chance was essentially zero. And then there were the direct voice seances, which sound kind of terrifying when you read the accounts. Mediums like Leslie Flint could produce voices that spoke independently in the air, not coming from the medium's mouth, but from empty space in the room. And investigators would even tape the medium's mouth shut, fill her mouth with water, or even hold their throat. I'm sorry, that's just so funny to me. Even hold their throat to ensure that they weren't speaking. And the voices would still continue. Multiple voices speaking simultaneously from different locations in the room. Voices that claimed to be specific deceased individuals and could provide verifiable information about their lives. In one documented case, a voice claiming to be a deceased soldier gave detailed information about military operations that were later verified through official records. Another voice spoke in a regional dialect and provided information about local historical events that the medium had really no way of knowing. Then, of course, we have the classical physical phenomena. And this is the whole tables levitating completely off the ground while multiple witnesses have their hands on the surface, musical instruments playing by themselves in sealed rooms, objects materializing and dematerializing. So Daniel Douglas Home was probably the most famous physical medium of the era. He was tested under controlled conditions by scientists, including Sir William Crookes, who had discovered the element thallium and invented the Crookes tube. Not exactly a gullible observer, if you might say, but Crookes documented Home levitating tables, accordions playing by itself while Home held only one end of the instrument, and Home himself levitating and floating out one window and in through another on the third floor of a building. I feel like these people had to be on drugs or something. But multiple witnesses, controlled conditions, detailed documentation. Then finally, back to the Golden Dawn, members who were having their own intense experiences. W.B. Yeats wrote extensively about visions that would occur during group rituals, seeing Egyptian gods manifesting in the temple, receiving detailed symbolic communications, experiencing what he described to be complete alterations of consciousness. And there are records of Golden Dawn rituals where members would spontaneously speak in languages they didn't know, where ritual objects would move on their own, and where the temperature in the room would, obviously drop dramatically during invocations. So Arthur Mackin, another Golden Dawn member, described experiences during pathworking sessions where the visualizations became so vivid that they seemed more real than ordinary reality. And he talked about encountering entities that felt completely autonomous, not products of his imagination, but independent beings with their own agendas. So when I study Victorian occultism, what strikes me most is really the sheer ambitions of these people, clearly. And they weren't content to just practicing folk magic or follow traditional religious forms. While I certainly am more traditional in the dirt folk practicing witch, I am deeply inspired by the psychology of magic as well. So, especially when exploring the mind, and that's really what they wanted. They wanted to explore the mind. They wanted to understand how consciousness worked, which obviously I don't think anyone does. But they wanted to map the invisible realms. They wanted to create reliable and teachable methods for spiritual development and magical practice. And they were willing to do the work. Years of study, thousands of experiments, detailed documentation, whether they are real or not, they are still pretty detailed. And, they approached magic with the same rigor that their contemporaries were applying to chemistry and physics and medicine. So, if there's one thing you guys take from this episode today, um, I hope it's a couple of laughs because that shit is really funny, but I think it's extremely interesting. It's definitely super spooky. And when you look up photos and look at the documents I will source, um, make up your own mind about it. And well, I hope you all enjoyed this one this week. Maybe even inspired you to hold your own little Victorian inspired seance this Samhain, or even try some new techniques. You can adapt them to fit however they should in your magical life. So really, that's all I have for this one. Wherever you are in the world, of course, have a wonderful morning, day, or night, and an even spookier Samhain this season.